In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, our one true God. Greetings, everybody. My name is Archbishop Gregory, head of the Genuine Orthodox Church of America, and now we are continuing in our series, Orthodoxy Today, Exposing the Heretics, but we have more information to add on our previous video of the Romanian Old Calendarists, Old Stylists. That was 10, and now this is 10a. Romania has two churches. The state church, heretical church, embedded in the heresy of ecumenism and masonry and modernism. The church is a racket. And then they have the old style, the old calendar church, which is the biggest old calendar movement in the world. But don't be confused because of numbers. The Romanian people are sick and tired of the state church, and they're looking for an alternative, and they gravitate towards the old calendar. But they don't know. And we are trying to explain to them how both churches have lost their apostolic succession. There's no holiness there. There's no grace. There's no valid ordinations. That's all there is. There is betrayals and denials. And the blame of all of this tragedy rests solely on the heads of the bishops, because they have betrayed their promise to God to uphold the faith. So now I am going to introduce our Bishop John, and he's going to explain all the details which the Romanian people should know, should be aware of. God bless you.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, our one true God. Thank you all for joining us. Archbishop Gregory has asked me to contribute a small portion of this presentation about the history of the Sinodul Slătioara, the Old Stylists, as they're called, or the B.O.S.V.R, the Romanian acronym. So I'm going to present information to help clarify the whole story of Slătioara, beginning with their hierarch, Galaxian Cordun. But the history of our modern era is filled with a lot of very disappointing and scandalous events, unfortunately. But for the sake of these sincere souls that were led astray through this entirely uncanonical organization, and for our own education, we are undertaking this effort for your sake. Now, there are multiple accounts of Galaxian's life, even beginning from his early childhood, that are contradictory on several critical points. And so we have endeavored, looking at multiple sources in the original language and researching as best as we can to construct an accurate history of where this man started and what motivated him to do the things he did. Now, you should understand that obfuscation, that is, a blurring of the facts of a person's life, is a very effective way to obscure the history of the entire organization. And that is not done by accident in the case of this person. It is not to the advantage of the leaders of the Slătioara Synod for their people to know the whole story of what happened with them and how they were formed. And that is why, even as we have been in the midst of producing these videos, the Synod of Slătioara has released several documents to try to refute what we have said thus far, even rewriting their history to try to contradict the historical facts that they probably have intentionally hid from tens of thousands of innocent people. So that's a critical piece of information for you to understand before we delve into this labyrinth. there is an intentional obfuscation, an intentional effort to conceal the real story of Slătioara. So, Galaktyan was born in 1883. Where things begin to get confusing is when he's about 20, 25 years old and begins his ecclesiastical career. So there are some sources say that he began his monastic career in 1904 and sent him, and he went to Odessa as a seminary student. There are other sources that say that he began in 1905, where he was made when he was made a monk at the Calderushani monastery, and he was ordained a deacon at that time. There are other sources that say that he was made a priest monk in 1914, going a little bit further down the road, and that he was elevated to the rank of protosingulos, which is a high honor for a young hieromonk to be given at such an age. In 1915, he proceeded to become the provisionally appointed priest of the Metropolitan Cathedral of Bucharest. And then in 1916, he was elevated to the rank of archimandrite. So he was about 32 years old when he was elevated to the rank of archimandrite. Now, unfortunately, there is either very little or no documentary evidence to confirm the ecclesiastical education that Galaktyan claims to have received in Russia. So it appears that the time that he spent in Russia, and this is of course before the Soviet Revolution, he was receiving some kind of an education there, but the amount of time that he spent there, and when he finally came back to Romania, he said that he had obtained certain ecclesiastical degrees or theological certificates from various universities, and on the basis of those claims, he was able to obtain a position as a deacon in the famous monastery of Nyamts, where the relics of St. Paisius Velishkovsky are. However, looking over his archive, several researchers have been unable to confirm that he obtained any of those degrees, that perhaps they were given to him as a favor for who knows what. Going a little bit further on into the history, I'm going to jump ahead to 1935, and this is when Galaktyan is going to be elevated to the episcopacy. Now, a lot has happened in Romania between 1916, 1917, when the Germans came to occupy the country. And between 1917, when the Germans actually tried to get the Romanian Patriarchate to celebrate Nativity and Pascha on the Roman Catholic calendar, and now finally 1935, when already they have adopted the new calendar for the entire country, Galaktyan initially expressed opposition to celebrating Pascha with the Roman Catholics as well as Nativity, not on the basis of any substantial theological reason, but only because he considered it to be a moral blow to the structure of the Romanian Patriarchate, which would allow the Roman Catholics to gain traction and influence in the country. But as far as the new calendar itself was concerned, Galaktyan didn't consider the new calendar to be a problem. In fact, he advocated for the introduction of the new calendar. So, in 1935, he was presented as a candidate for the episcopacy to be ordained under the Patriarch Miron Christea. Now, Miron Christea, the Patriarch of Romania, was the Patriarch that not only introduced the new calendar into the country, but also celebrated Pascha twice in violation of the canons of the First Ecumenical Council, celebrated Pascha with the Roman Catholics before the Jewish Passover, which is exactly what the First Ecumenical Council was trying to prevent. So Galaktyan was a member of the Patriarchate and accepted to do that along with Patriarch Miron Christea. He's already setting a track record for compromising the faith from 1917 going forward, unfortunately. And he's making a career out of this. Now, there was a time that Galactian was publishing materials that were against the Protestants or against the Jews or against bad habits in Romanian society. And he published quite a few articles prior to becoming a bishop. But the objective of his efforts in this sphere of influence was simply to build up a reputation for himself as being a faithful son of the church. But that wasn't actually to propagate those true teachings or to increase the morality of the people. He wasn't doing that because his own life was an example of those things, but he was asked by the government to actually produce materials like that. So no one should be confused about that in the 1920s when he was producing materials like that. So it's on the 31st of March, 1935, Galactian was ordained to the episcopacy as a vicar bishop, and he never rose higher than the position of a vicar bishop, although he begged throughout his episcopal career to be granted the rights of a ruling bishop. He did everything he could to obtain that position, but the Romanian Patriarchate prevented him from doing that, probably for a good reason. Shortly after that is when I think you could say that Galactian made one of the biggest mistakes of his life. He was appointed on October 2nd of the same year to the Commission for Doctrine and Religious Life. The Commission for the Doctrine and Religious Life's purpose was to study the question of combating the old calendarists in its entirety and to present the necessary measures for calming the spirits and discouraging subversive propaganda. Now, this information is gathered and presented by an author whose name is Radu Mureșan, who published a work called Stylism. Stylism is in reference to the old calendarists. Stylism in Romania from 1924 to 2011. This book was published within the last 10 years. But the source material for this publication is taken from the debates of the Holy Synod in a work called the Romanian Orthodox Church. This is official documentation that is contained in the archives of the Romanian government concerning the history of the Orthodox Church in Romania by first-hand witnesses. Following this, on the 13th of October, Galactian made the following proposal, quote, "The Holy Synod is requested to renew the appeal to the government to take the necessary measures so that all state authorities may show their support for the full implementation of the corrected calendar." So Galactian is directly involved in propagating and forcing people to accept the new calendar. Now please remember this year, I'm going to come back to this a little bit later because there's a lot more information about this event that is exceedingly grievous, but I will save that for a latter part of the presentation. Okay. In other words, Galactian is a devoted propagator of the implementation of the new calendar from 1935 onwards. And what the Romanian government did in collaboration with the church to make that happen is a tragedy. Following his consecration to the episcopacy, it was about 1 year later, on the 21st of March in 1936, when Galactian began to have problems with his ruling bishop, Bartholomew. And it appears Bartholomew made a complaint in the synod that Galactian was attempting to have him removed from his episcopal office. He was slandering his ruling bishop and acting in total disobedience. As a result of these accusations, Galactian was removed and transferred to another diocese which they created for his sake. In the episcopal archives, it is noted that Galactian's reputation during that period specifically in 1937 and moving on to 1938, he was noted as having behaved in a manner unworthy of the ministry entrusted to him, being accused of abuses, theft of church property, and an immoral life. Galactian was transferred on October 25th, 1938, to the Diocese of Constanța with the title of Craioveanul, that is to say, Bishop of the region around the city of Craiova. Galactian held the office of Secretary of the Holy Synod from 1935 to 1948. I want to point that out because no matter what he was doing, he was an integral part of anything that was going on in the Patriarchate itself. In 1940, after the death of Patriarch Miron Christea, following the appointment of a new Patriarch, Justinian Marina, a special report was submitted to the Patriarch concerning Galactian's history. Of course, this information was known to the Patriarch that consented to the ordination to the episcopacy of Galactian, but now it came to a head because there were a lot of problems going on with him. Quote, Galactian, quote, was the protagonist of a scandal sparked by his affair with an actress, Lucia Colin, from Iași, with whom he had a child. There was a court decision by sentence 558/July 21st, 1941 of the Bucharest Court of Appeal, Section 2, in which Galactian was obliged to pay child support and in which Galactian acknowledged the paternity of the son of Mrs. Lucia Colin from Iași. So not only was Galactian ineligible to be ordained to any rank of the priesthood, but he should have been deposed from office. So Galactian's service to the church, if you want to call it that, is a classic example of a wolf in sheep's clothing. And it's because of reasons like this, and the reasons that I just mentioned briefly above, that Galactian's reputation among the clergy of the state church was something comparable to Rasputin, and even he was named like that as a second Rasputin. Now, I would like to share with you an important personage in this history, a man whose name is Dudu Veliciu. Dudu Veliciu was the secretary of Patriarch Miron Christea, and he was also the secretary of Eugene Cristescu, who is the director of the intelligence services from 1941 to 1944. Dudu Velescu's notes are extensive about Galactian Cordun, and there's a few things here that you should be aware of. Around the time of, say, 1946, Cordun was doing everything that he could to find a position as a ruling bishop. And in order to accomplish that, he was eliciting the support from various government officials, among whom was Radu Rosculets, who was the Minister of Religious Affairs. This Radu advised Galactian to run, that is, campaign, for the office of Metropolitan of Oltenia. Now, Oltenia is the southern part of Romania. However, Galactian withdrew himself from the candidacy because he was afraid of the backlash from the people of Oltenia who knew his history and knew that he was clothing himself in a cloak of righteousness to conceal his immoral past. In the following year, 1947, Radu, the government minister, again asked the Patriarch of Romania to appoint Galactian as a patriarchal vicar. The Patriarch at that time in 1947 was Nicodemus, and he refused. to elevate Galactian to that position because, quote, he knows too well Cordun's lack of seriousness and morality. This was published from the daily notes of the Romanian Orthodox Church in the period of Romanian Sovietization, published by Alina Pavlescu in 2004. On February 12th of 1948, Galactian was visited at his home in the courtyard of the St. Spiridon Church in Bucharest, which was his new residence after having been removed from episcopal office to some extent. You know what, I don't even want to talk about this because it's disgusting. The officers that came to visit Galactian's apartment at this place, quote, were struck by the smell of perfume from his bedrooms. Galactian allowed them to come inside, excused himself as if he was ill. One of the officers, named Tuta, expressed to Galactian that he owed a lot to the church, to the Patriarchate. Galactian responded to the contrary, the church owes me, being abbot of Neamț Monastery, and he revealed to the investigators about the catastrophic moral situation at the Neamț Monastery, which included homosexuality. There has to be an explanation of why such a catastrophic moral collapse could occur in an Orthodox church. And I want to introduce the next topic as a possible reason why this happened in Romania. So yes, the introduction of the new calendar is a serious problem. There's no doubt about that. But how do things like that happen? How is it that the church is blind to the political agenda of the world around us? On the 2nd of March in 1948, a priest of the Romanian Patriarchate confessed to Dudu Veliciu that, quote, Bishop Cordun, like Petru Groza, the Prime Minister, Metropolitan Nicolae Balan of Transylvania, the priests Liviu Stan and Spiridon Condea, professors at CBU, and the Prime Minister's ministerial advisors are all Freemasons and work according to the instructions of a lodge in London, where Metropolitan Balan is the Grand Master in the 33rd degree. Again, published by Mrs. Pavlescu, Bucharest in 2005. I want to go back and just mention also that Patriarch Miron Cristea was also a Freemason, and that fact is easily confirmable by Masonic sources all over the internet, which identify him in his role, and it was specifically indicated that he wanted that information to be propagated. This technique of the Masons infiltrating the church and then doing things to the church from within the structure of the church is a catastrophe that is unique to our era. So, if an enemy of the church succeeds in infiltrating the church and obtaining a position like this within the church, he has a lot of influence to advance a very evil agenda. And that is how Galactian, unfortunately, collapsed into these moral things, these moral transgressions of the law of Christ. Because first and foremost, God knows when he became a Mason, but the fact is, there is irrefutable proof in the government archives that this was the case. Moving on now to January 1st of 1949, with all of this information coming forward, and even more that is testifying to the immoral life of Galactian, the Patriarch Justinian Marina retires Galactian Cordun from his position as Secretary of the Holy Synod due to old age, they say. Now, I have to point out There is no canon, there is no tradition in the Church that allows a bishop to retire from the episcopacy for any other reason other than a collapse of their health. The fact that they are giving a justification that he's too old now to serve, that's obvious. There's only one reason that they did that, just to try to cover up the scandals that were trailing behind this man from the beginning of his ecclesiastical career until 1949. That's the only reason. And also, that fact is confirmed because notice in just a few years after this, Galactian is going to be very happy to resume his work as a bishop, taking up the leadership of the Slătioara Synod. So there was nothing physically wrong with him. It's just he was living a very immoral life, unfortunately. The positions that Galactian held throughout his career in the Patriarchate are as follows. He was a bishop vicar, he was a bishop's deputy, and he was the secretary of the synod. And that's it. Unfortunately, Slătioara falsely misleads people by trying to say that from 1949 going forward, Galactian continued to serve as a bishop, but following the Julian, that is the church calendar, in the monastery of Rametz, where Abbot Evlogius welcomed him. This is a complete and utter lie. Galactian retired from the episcopacy in 1949, and his immoral lifestyle continued unchecked. On the 18th of August in 1949, quote, which is the Dormition, the feast of the Dormition of Our Lady Theotokos. I don't even want to read the details of this. Please just allow me to say it's sufficient that there are public witnesses to Galactian's indiscretions in his monastery with... I'm going to jump ahead now to the autumn of 1954, which is the beginning of the relationship between Glikiri and Galactian. In 1954, someone placed into the hands of Glikiri the letter of protest that Galactian had written in 1916 against celebrating Nativity and Pascha under the pressure of the German occupiers with the Roman Catholics. And when Glikiri, who had already been searching for, as Archbishop Gregory has eloquently explained, for anyone that would ordain him to the episcopacy, found this letter, he had a glimmer of hope that he could start something with Galactian. In the following year, 1955, Galactian was in the military hospital in Bucharest, and it was there that Glikiri arranged a meeting with him. Galactian confirmed that he was the author of that letter, and they came to an agreement to join together. On April 5th, 1955, the Central Council of the Old Style Church of the Romanian People's Republic published the following article, which they sent to the Patriarch of Romania. Quote, "We, the Central Council of the Old Style Church of the RPR, having met today, April 5th, 1955, in extraordinary session, and having taken note of the unanimous desire of all the parish committees of the whole Republic belonging to our group, to have His Grace Bishop Galactian Cordun as their spiritual leader, declare that we, the Central Council, have unanimously and wholeheartedly consented to have at our head His Grace Bishop Galactian, who is an old and worthy fighter for the cause of the old calendar." It goes on, but let's note the similarities between this letter, this declaration, and the declaration that was issued by the infamous Abbess Mariam and the Protosingulos Evgenios Tombros, who are essentially the founders of the Matthewite schism. Galactian, now 6 years following his retirement from the episcopacy, presents the following letter to the Patriarch of Romania, writes the following, quote, I, that is Galactian Cordun, hereby declare before the clergy and people of all parishes and monasteries on the territory of the Romanian People's Republic that I, Hierarch Galactian Cordun, of my own free will and unsolicited by anyone, have accepted the proposal and the choice that the people have made in my person to be the spiritual chief of this church. Now, this expression, spiritual chief, is an awkward expression to translate into English from Romanian. It is not an ecclesiastical concept. Another way to translate chief would be like boss. In response to this action of Galactian, the Romanian Patriarchate, under Patriarch Justinian Marina, convenes urgently in an extraordinary meeting on April 14th, which happened to be Holy Thursday, leading up to Pascha. And the result of that hierarchical meeting was the deposition of Galactian Cordun. The first person to protest the deposition of Galactian is none other than Father Gliciri of Slătioara. What is the significance of that? If you consider the Romanian Patriarchate to be a heretical church from 1924 onward, in schism, outside of the church, devoid of grace, why would you consider the deposition of Galactian Cordun to be anything other than absolutely meaningless? Why would you respond to that event with a protest? The letter which I just read to you, where Galactian announces his position as spiritual chief of the Old Calendarists of Romania, Galactian shared that letter with several people of import in the world at that time, among whom was the infamous Patriarch Alexei of Moscow, who is the successor of Sergiy Stogorodsky. Galactian Cordun recognized the episcopal succession of Patriarch Alexei, something which the Russian Church abroad condemned as utterly invalid and meaningless, since the Church in Russia, at that time, and even up until now, is an instrument of the government. Please call to mind that the institution of so-called Patriarch Alexei, was anathematized by none other than Saint Tikhon, Patriarch of Moscow, on February 1st, 1918. It is to the head of this institution, which is the primary means by which the communists exterminated 80 million plus people, 80 million Orthodox Christians. It's to the head of this organization that Galactian Cordun notifies that he has taken up leadership of the Old Calendarists. They should have known immediately, when they learned of that fact, that they had made a catastrophic error. They should have known that. Now, if you think that Galactian's relationship with Patriarch Alexei was just at his enthronement or his taking up this position, no, you'd be mistaken, because he's going to write to him several letters, which are included. We're going to take a look at those right now. So, following his deposition by the State Church of Romania and the revocation of his pension, which was not expected, Galactian sent a letter on April 19th, 1955, which I'm going to read to you right now. Quote, His Holiness, Patriarch Alexei of Moscow, we respectfully request you to urgently intervene in high forums against Patriarch Justinian, who has started a persecution to destroy true Christians in the PRR, that is Romania, as well as those whom your holiness leads, beginning with me, their spiritual father and archbishop, because we hold fast and unwaveringly, as you do, without any deviation, to the eternal and permanent preservation of the doctrines and the teachings of the Holy Fathers and the Sobors, that is councils, handed down to us by them as an inheritance and for eternal preservation. Patriarch Tikhon anathematized these people. Galactian identifies them as preservers of the tradition of the Fathers and the councils. We all prostrate ourselves and all the souls of the Romanian old style before your holiness, awaiting as soon as possible your word of intervention as the first hierarch of true Christianity, and for paternal comfort and encouragement for us who are oppressed and persecuted. A second letter from Galactian. At the moment, the one who is addressing these lines to you, you must know from the beginning that he is the former Romanian colleague of your holiness. Holiness and Patriarch Alexei should not ever be in the same sentence. Okay. You must know from the beginning that he is the former Romanian colleague of your holiness and of the most holy Metropolitan of Moscow, Nicolae Krutitsky, whom you recognized and were recognized on the occasion of the investiture as Patriarch of Romania, of the current head of the Romanian Church, both in the cathedral and in the Church of St. Spiridon, where his enthronement took place. I am, myself, the one who signed here, or at this moment by the will of God, who has always protected us and the Russian people, from a religious point of view, happily led at this moment by your holiness, who by his divine will, which has also protected us, the sole shepherd in the Romanian country, of the old style, which is the fundamental basis on all the establishments of the Holy Fathers and of our Orthodox Christian councils, which from the beginning of the Christian era until the present time, and which your holiness and your entire church, which you lead with so much worth and zeal, you rely and stand firm and steadfast on these eternal and divine truths from now until the end of the age. For this reason, we are all together on the eve of the Holy Pascha. We take the liberty of sending you our warmest good wishes for the Church and the fearless faithful whom you lead with such zeal and unparalleled worthiness, embracing you as a humble brother in the hierarchy, and ending this epistle with the traditional Christos Voskrese. Signed, Archbishop and Metropolitan Galactian. Okay, this is long after Galactian has left the Romanian Patriarchate. He is already well entrenched in the leadership of Slătioara, and he is sending paschal greetings to an anathematized church, to a fountain of persecution against the church. How is it that the faithful people of Romania, who follow the old calendar, who had a sincere desire to observe the canons of the church, time and time again violated those canons in the person of Galactian, Gliceri, and their other hierarchs? How did that happen? What was the justification for the violation of the canons? There was one very simple reason. When you elevate a person, whoever that is, to the level of a so-called saint, the status of saint means you can violate every canon out there. You can do whatever you want because we have a saint in our midst. And Gliceri was elevated to this level either in his simplicity, God knows what was going through his mind, but the people of Slătioara elevated this man to the level of a divine prophet, so that anything he said about anything was a guiding light for the entire church. And so any violations of the canons that he committed were justifiable. A person like that cannot be subject to any criticism. No one is allowed to say anything or to even ask a question, are we doing the right thing? The answer is obvious. Of course we're doing the right thing. A saint is leading us in these difficult times. No, you cannot do that. According to the ecclesiology of Slătioara, which is inspired by the Matthewite ecclesiology, which probably Glicchidi was exposed to in the early part of his life living on Mount Athos, when he had contact with Matthew, as well as some of the other Greco-Calendrist bishops. According to their ecclesiology, it is possible for the people and the clergy who do not have a bishop leading them to receive an apostate bishop back into the church if that bishop will repent of his heresy. What's the problem with that? So when the Lord said, I have established my church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against that, is that in any way connected to the apostolic succession of the hierarchy? Yes, it is. It's not just a promise that the concept of the church is going to remain inviolable until the end of time. We are saying that when the apostles laid their hands on the bishops whom they ordained, and then those bishops ordained other bishops, we are saying that that structure is going to continue until the end, the consummation of the age. That we're not saying that that is only the church, but that is an integral part of the church. If you take the approach that we're going to reach the point where there is no hierarchy in the church any longer, then you can just look back to what the old believers did when they completely lost all of their priests. They had no bishops, and so the only thing they preserved, they imagined, was baptism and chrismation from a layman, because they thought there is no hierarchy left. Even to this day, they're thinking that way. That's not the church. That's not the tradition of the church. All of the fathers agree on this. The liturgy will continue until the very end. Well, how are you going to have a liturgy with just lay people? You can't do that. You have to have the episcopacy. You have to have the priesthood. Glicchidi was of this other mentality, that it's possible for the lay people to accept the repentance of a graceless bishop. There are some who say that Glicchidi anointed Galactian with holy myrrh when he was received in repentance. If an ecclesiastical entity, let's call the old calendarists of Slătioara a church, have the authority from God to receive a graceless bishop back into the church and bestow upon him apostolic succession, that means they have the right, they have the authority to ordain anyone to the episcopacy. Why would they wait for the repentance of a heretic to have a bishop? They could have just ordained their own bishop from nothing. I don't know if they ever thought about that. What I'm about to read to you now is probably the most important part of this presentation. I would like now to present an important letter that Metropolitan Galactian wrote to the Minister of the Interior on the 19th of May in 1955. So there are a lot of important points in here, but I want to just focus on one particular point, and I will get to that very quickly. Galactian writes, a large part of the Christians in our country who are Orthodox have refused to obey the decisions taken by the hierarchs who have apostatized from Orthodoxy. Now, of course, he's talking about those who have adopted the new calendar and have submitted the church to the communist authority, which is now in full swing in Romania in 1955. And they have understood, they have the desire to preserve the holy faith without additions, without subtractions, and without innovations, in order not to fall under the anathemas of the Holy Fathers, by not respecting the Orthodox Church's establishments. For 30 years, the old-style Orthodox Church, which has remained in this country like a ship without a helmsman, the Savior Jesus Christ, who is the head of the Church, has protected us. And although we have gone through difficult trials, we have not renounced and will not renounce our holy faith. It has been hard to endure the conditions in which we have found ourselves. Our church, since 1924, has not had a single hierarch to shepherd, to lead, to teach, to care for the salvation of the souls of her spiritual sons, having been asked by the faithful of this church to be their spiritual leader. And I, as one who suffered for the same cause, even before 1924, under the German occupation, being convinced that this is the only truth, enthusiastically accepted to take the leadership of this church. Okay, so let's just go back for a minute to the beginning of our presentation, when I informed you that Galactian decided to join. He decided to accept consecration to the episcopacy in 1935. Galactian never joined the old calendarist zealots of any group in Romania. And in 1935, having accepted to be consecrated to the episcopacy, let's call to mind the committee to which he was appointed shortly after his consecration, towards the end of that year, whose purpose was the suppression of the old calendarist movement. So in this letter, he's representing himself as a victim of the persecution perpetrated on the old calendarists, hiding from the Minister of the Interior that he was instrumental in that persecution. Now he continues, our most Orthodox group has only 10 priests for the tens of thousands of believers who belong to us. And as I am daily called upon by these believers to ordain their priests and to consecrate their churches, please do not do anything more than proceed exactly as you have done with all of the other groups in Romania, giving, according to all the laws applicable, due recognition, and all the more so that those who ask for this authority to function legally are the same Christians who, in 1936 to 1937, were shot en masse with machine guns, had all of their churches demolished, and all of their clerics arrested, most of whom died in prisons. So in this letter, Galactian is identifying the group that he leads with those Christians that were put to death in 1936 and 1937. What he leaves out is that it was his responsibility to help facilitate that suppression. Final paragraph. Whatever the wishes of the official church, which we are sure does not look favorably on a return to orthodoxy, we maintain and emphasize that in returning to the true style, that is the old calendar, I have done nothing more than to place myself in the bosom of all the Orthodox churches which have remained within the framework of the decisions of the Holy Councils, the largest of which is the Church of the Soviet Union itself, which maintains the old calendar. I don't know if there is anything more profound that reveals the ecclesiastical activity of Galactian that clearly expresses where his actual and true sentiments were, not for the suffering laity of Romania, who were endeavoring to keep the tradition of the Church, but for his own advancement. He has contacts with the Patriarch of Moscow, the Patriarch of Bulgaria, both of whom were infiltrated by the Communist Party, and now his letter to the Interior of the Minister of the Interior of Romania, in which he clearly states, for the historical record, what happened to the old calendarists in Romania, and his obvious involvement in that, explains his subsequent actions very clearly. I want to point out now that less than 5 months after Galactian accepted the leadership position of the old calendarists, he wrote a letter to the Patriarch of Romania, in which he asked for forgiveness for being led astray by the scoundrels, quote-unquote, of Slătioara. This is the first time that Galactian is going to attempt to have his pension restored by the government authorities and to be received back into communion with the official church. He is going to attempt this 2 more times, but the Patriarch is going to remain firm in his decision to not allow Galactian to return to the church as a clergyman. The result of this is that just a few months afterwards, Galactian proceeded to perform a one-handed consecration. He proceeds to ordain Archimandrite of B.O.S.V.R to the episcopacy. In 1956, there is no negative reaction to this action within the ranks of Slătioara, despite the fact that multiple canons are being violated. There is no justification for Slătioara to receive a one-handed consecration on the basis of this horrible decision. I'd like to point out that it's not possible for a vicar bishop to perform any ordinations at all without the permission of his ruling bishop. Galactian considered it his prerogative to elevate himself to metropolitan archbishop. How and in what way is incomprehensible that a vicar bishop, that any bishop, has the authority to elevate himself from the rank of a vicar to the rank of a ruling bishop is not possible. Nevertheless, in the mind of Slătioara, whose final objective actually was the ordination, the consecration of Glicchidi himself, but they didn't want to make that so apparent by ordaining him to the episcopacy first. Therefore, they proceeded with Otsa, and then another one. And finally, after all of this, in 1956 again, Glicchidi was ordained to the episcopacy after 20 years of wishing for that. He was ordained by Archimandrite Methodius, who was elevated to the episcopacy, along with Otsa and Galactian Gordun together. And this was the final consecration that Gordun performed to the episcopacy for the old calendarists of Slătioara. From that point on, just a few years following this, Galactian will die, and Glicchidi will be elevated to the rank of leader of the whole group. Now, as I mentioned previously, I'd like to just reiterate now, when a person has been elevated to the rank of saint, and they have a word for this in Greek, where someone is just selected as the leader of the group, it's called prosopon latria, and it literally means face worship, where someone is selected to be the infallible leader of an entire group of people with no accountability to the canons or to the fellow hierarchs or to the tradition of the church. That's how a person can accept ordination to the episcopacy by a single-handed consecration, and then proceed to apply for legal recognition from a communist government, and then enjoy the benefits of protection of the Communist Party. It would be a good question for the members of Slătioara to answer for themselves why their church, following the consecrations of Galacti and Cordun never suffered any persecution from the government. It was on the 8th/21 of July, 1959, when Galacti and Cordun died. He was buried in the northwestern part of the church of Slătioara Monastery. Despite his best efforts to return to communion with the Patriarch. Okay, I realize this presentation has been a bit lengthy, but I thank everyone for their patience and attentiveness in absorbing this information. And now we will return to Archbishop Gregory's concluding statements for this entire presentation. And we wish you God's blessing and mercy. Amen.
Okay, now that we've heard the history of the old calendar style Romanian church, there's one question that still lingers among a lot of people. How is it possible that in 1992, the Russian Church abroad entered into communion with the Romanians? How could that happen? Why did that happen? It all happened through the poor leadership of Metropolitan Vitali, with no discretion, no discernment of what is right and what is wrong. And also because of Mark of Berlin, through the conniving, plotting, and deception of one person, Archbishop Mark of Berlin, someone who should never have been made a bishop. He's not even baptized. I remember when they told me they're going to ordain someone from Germany, and I asked of Metropolitan Vitali, what do you know about him? Does he know Orthodoxy? And that's all they could say is, he speaks Russian. Well, does he know, has he been taught the faith? Is he obedient? And that's all he could say. Hey, he speaks Russian, and he's from Germany. And is that the reason to ordain someone like this? Well, we found out bitterly that he is a disobedient bishop, following his probably spiritual father, Archbishop Anthony of Geneva. But when you have one or two bishops who do not want to listen to the synod, to the pronouncements of the whole synod, that does not condemn the whole church. It may condemn, and probably does condemn, those two bishops for their disobedience. So Mark was made a bishop, and he starts on his life of disobedience, thinking that he knows better than everybody. And so he goes and concelebrates with this person that we are not in communion with, and concelebrates with the Cyprianites. Here, show the picture of Mark concelebrating with the Cyprianites years before the Russian Church abroad was unlawfully in communion with them. So he decided that he is going to make a motion before our synod in 1992 that we go in communion with the Romanian Old Calendar Church. And he had the liberal bishops on his side, Archbishop Lauris, the future Metropolitan Ilarion, and he told our bishops, these people are Orthodox, pristine Orthodox. They suffered a lot because of their faith. They are spiritual people, They really know the faith. They have a faith just like ours of the Russian Church. So Metropolitan Vitali said, okay, we go into communion with them. They had a vote, and the vote was to enter into communion with the Romanian Church. Well, it didn't work out very well. The head of the Romanians at that time was Metropolitan Vlasi. And when he came to America after the Union and met with the Russian Church, the Synod of the Russian Church, do you think that he would say, thank you so much for overlooking the fact that we had our apostolic succession? We traced our bishopric back to this Galactian Gordun. So do you think Metropolitan Vlasi told the Russian bishops, thank you for overlooking the fact that our first hierarch, Metropolitan Galactian Gordun, when he was a priest, fornicated with a Romanian actress and had a baby boy, and had to pay child support, because the courts made him pay child support until the boy was old enough to go into a monastery. Thank you, all Russian bishops, that you overlooked the fact that our first hierarch shouldn't even have been in the clergy. Thank you. And then after he put his bottle of vodka on the table, had a few sips, do you think he would say to the Russian bishops, thank you, O Russian bishops, that you overlooked the fact that our first hierarch had such an insatiable sexual desire to be with women? He should have been married. He should have never become a priest or a deacon. But the Romanian Church kept him in the clergy and did not depose him, didn't make him a layman. We thank you for overlooking that fact. Bishop Gordun was left in the clergy even after he was a fornicator. And we kept him in the clergy. In fact, we even ordained him a bishop. You think that Vlasius told the Russian bishops this? So, do you think Metropolitan Vlasi told the Russian bishops? When Galactian was made head of the Romanian Old Calendar movement, he immediately wrote his friend, my beloved Patriarch Alexei of Moscow, the communist patriarch of the Soviet Church. He notified him, told him, I finally made it as chief and head of the church in Romania. How do you explain that? And then he would think, take another drink from his vodka, and he would say, we thank you also for the fact that you overlooked that our Metropolitan Gordun made a single-handed ordination, which your Saint Philaret said was unacceptable. But you accepted it with our Galactian Gordun. Thank you very much. Here, and probably made a toast to them and drank some more vodka. Yes, when he came, that fifth of vodka had to be on the table before him. That's Vlasy. It was told to me by Archbishop Anthony of Los Angeles. He did not make a good impression on the bishops. This is the Romanian Church entered into communion with the Russians by deception. All because Mark of Berlin and most likely Laurus of Holy Trinity Monastery, Jordanville, and Ilarion, the liberal bishops in the Russian Church, they forced this on the Russian Church. This opened the door for the Russian Church to go into communion with Cyprian. And then from Cyprian, the Russian Church would enter in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate. So the first mistake was being deceived with the Romanians, thanks to the deceiver, Mark of Berlin. Okay, so why did not Metropolitan Vlasy voluntarily tell the Russian bishops that Metropolitan Galaction Cordun should have been thrown out of the priesthood because of his immoral life? And now we know why. It's because he himself, Vlasy, had the same sickness and disease, and was himself had his own woman. Sad. So this explains how the Russian Church went into communion with the Romanians. It was done by deception. Thank you for listening, and now that you know the history, there is none left standing except for our church that has remained pure in its orthodoxy. God bless you all, and God enlighten you to do the right thing.